I'm very excited to introduce Pat Furlong and Mark Kruger, who are going to come up. They've done this amazing work in terms of shaping regulatory policies that put patients first. And I think this is something we can all learn from. Pat Furlong, who's the founding president and CEO of the Parent Project for Muscular Dystrophy, and Mark Kruger, who's the president of Mark Kruger and Associates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy and Nicole, and thank you for inviting us here. Thanks for the mics. Mark and I were thinking of doing a duet just to start off. So we wanted to talk about shaping regulatory policy. And to begin with, now that the slides are up, as Wendy mentioned, I am president of PPMD, and Mark Kruger has been our project manager on our project, which we're going to talk about, which is writing draft guidance for the FDA. Next slide, or do I change? Is this one? Okay, good. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about an overview of writing draft guidance and why we did it and how we came to do it. Because sometimes, you want to change regulatory policy and you're a little bit stuck about how does it work, will it work, can you develop a model, and is the FDA going to pay any attention to it anyway? So that's what we embarked on, and I'm going to give you a little bit of the history. First, to understand the Duchenne muscular dystrophy environment. A long time ago, in 2001, there were no clinical trials in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. In fact, there was no investment, no substantial investment in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So in 2001, there was a bill called the MD CARE Act that was introduced in both the House and Senate. The bill was passed and signed into law in December of 2001, signed by George Bush. That, next to the cloning of the gene, galvanized the research community. So there is not any research that has been done that hasn't been touched by this investment. And over the last year, since 2001, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy research from NIH, Department of Defense, and the Center for Disease Control, there's been an investment of $200 million. So as you might imagine, that does galvanize a particular disease. Now, Duchenne muscular dystrophy is a disease that affects one in about 4,000 to 6,000 live male births. It's an X-linked monogenetic disease that affects boys primarily. Female carriers can have some mild symptoms too, moderate and seemingly severe symptoms, but it is really rare to see females with severe symptoms of Duchenne. It follows a fairly predictable course. The boys are born and they look very normal at birth. They have delayed motor milestones. If you knew really early symptoms of muscle weakness, you would see that these children are born with, they have a head lag, so you see weakness in the neck. They walk with a waddling gait, and they usually have very soft, kind of spongy muscles if you're really paying attention. And most of us, like myself when my boys were diagnosed, weren't really that observant or that knowledgeable about muscle disease. The predictable course that it follows is that these little boys will walk by the age of sometimes 14 months, some walk earlier. They gain strength. They refine their small and large muscle skills, so they're walking at 5 or 6 or 7 years old. Corticosteroids are used for these boys in a variety of different regimens and doses, and some of them are still walking into their 10 or 11 years old. By the time they're 13, they're usually off their feet. By the time they're 15, they can't move their arms. So for instance, they couldn't raise their arms up above their head by the time they're 13 or 14, and they're dead by the second decade, usually by 20 to 25 years old. So here's why we're here, because this is an environment where we all belong together. We're all here, and we're all going to be here. We have to start with the patient first and end with the patient because that is the primary importance. But basic science is here. The academics, clinicians are here, the regulators are here, the payers are here, all of these people are here, the policymakers are here, and we're all here together. So the only way to get anything done is for us to work consistently and together. So why would you ever develop draft guidance for the FDA? Well, you have to change regulatory policy, and they're used to looking at legislation, looking at guidance, because it's a process that helps guide what they do and how they think and how they view a particular submission. So, why the Duchenne community? We are at a pivotal moment. With the MD CARE Act in place, and certainly many, many companies, I think we now have 7 or 8 public companies and about 14 biotechs in this space, an investment that exceeds $5 billion. We have a robust pipeline that includes targets not only to replace or restore the dystrophin, the missing protein, replace it with another kind of protein. We also have nonsense suppression, which is the stop codon, or the period in the middle of the genetic sentence, if you will. We have technologies for the downstream pathology that occurs, and also technologies that are looking at the mitochondria, or the cell machinery itself. So we have lots of interest in this disease, lots of interest in stopping it at every point along the way, which is certainly what parents and family members want. So there's a lot known about Duchenne and its pathology. We have a robust pipeline, and certainly soon, and before the end of the year, the FDA is going to see submissions on several drugs that they're going to have to make a decision about. And the patient community needs, as fast as possible, drugs for these kids. So we had begun, probably 4 years ago, meeting with the FDA on a regular basis. We began to partner with them and talk about the unmet need. Without treatment, these boys die. So there aren't any options, and we wanted them to know that. We also wanted them to know what it's like to live with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. There are nights of no sleep. There's heartbreaks at every step of the way. There's heartbreaks every time there's a loss of function, which feels like on a daily basis. This child is falling, loses ambulation, unable to lift a fork, unable to scratch his head, unable to breathe. So these are things that the FDA wanted and needed to learn about unmet need. They also needed to learn what we thought about policy and how we fit into policy. So we engaged with a number of experts and wrote a paper called Putting Patients First. And this was to explore policy and how Duchenne muscular dystrophy slipped in or felt into that policy. And so the recommendations in the policy included the use of accelerated approval, breakthrough designation, and we also recommended in that paper that they think about adaptive approvals or conditional approvals that are used in Europe. Now, the FDA is not in favor of conditional approval, but we feel like it's not a topic that should end. We also talked about risk-benefit, and in our meeting with the FDA, we talked about the fact that the equation of risk-benefit is different in a rare disease than it is in a common disease, and that parents were very willing to prioritize what benefit would look like and also accept risks, and they lived with uncertainty every day, uncertainty that their child would continue to walk or continue to move, turn over in bed. And so the FDA agreed that the equation was probably different, but they didn't have any quantitative data to prove that one way or the other. So we partnered with Johns Hopkins University, John Bridges specifically, and we embarked on a pilot in benefit risk. And that pilot was the first pilot actually in our rare disease and in the pediatric rare community. And what we learned in the benefit risk was that parents prioritize slowing or stopping progression above all other things. Their second priority was to get optimal care for their children. Their least important priority was to take care of themselves. They were willing to accept risk, and they really had a thoughtful process of what kinds of risks they were willing to accept. An arrhythmia, they were willing to accept. Nausea, vomiting, headache. So these side effects that they considered are willing to accept in the face of benefit in terms of stabilization of the disease or stopping progression. In a later meeting with the FDA, we talked about the fact that the EMA had released guidance on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. That was released in the spring of 2013. We were disappointed in the EMA's guidance because of the fact that they had not included the patients in their guidance deliberations or in the product itself. So from that, the patient community around the world got together, and we had a meeting with Treat NMD, who led the endeavor. And we sat down with several members of the FDA and the EMA in Europe and talked to them about their guidance. And we talked to them about, from the patient perspective, what about the guidance we felt was inaccurate or needed to be considered in a different way. So in a follow-on meeting to the FDA, we talked about the fact that EMA had released guidance, and we had hoped that they would release guidance. Now, you'll remember back in PDUFA and the FDASIA deliberations that the FDA chose 20 conditions to focus on. We were in some of those discussions and had encouraged, along with NORD, along with the Global Genes and Every Life Foundation, that potentially, instead of picking 20 specific diseases, the FDA might want to consider looking at systems. And instead of looking at one disease, look at the disease that affect the GI system or the muscle system, skeletal muscle. Well, that didn't work. The FDA chose 20 conditions, and we weren't one of them. So then you have to kind of say to yourself, so how can you become noticed? How can you change regulatory policy? How can you impact the FDA's deliberation process? How can you help sponsors as they think about developing drugs in Duchenne? How can you lessen and accelerate the process of approval, or lessen the time it takes to get to approval? So we were in a meeting with the FDA. We talked about the fact of the EMA guidance. We talked about the response of the community and how successful we felt it was. And then the community released public comments to the EMA guidance, and we were asked to write guidance. So Dr. Woodcock and the Cedar Neurology Division said, why don't you embark on writing guidance? Well, you know, sometimes you say okay to things and you don't really think through what that might mean. So I'm happy to tell you that we were able to write guidance for the FDA. This was a community effort, and Mark's going to tell you about the process. But we engaged to do this guidance, the entire Duchenne muscular dystrophy. It was prefaced, and the platform for this was a repeat of the meeting that we held in London. We held this as a policy forum on December 6th of 2013. So this policy forum set the stage for us to then write draft guidance. We also had members of the community in a community advisory board, and Mark's going to talk to you more about process, but we had a steering committee. We had about 100 people that volunteered time and energy and talent in developing the draft guidance. You want to talk about process?
Thank you. Pat will return to the podium in just a moment, but I wanted to first acknowledge some members, some participants in this meeting who were a part of this process. Thank you. I wanted to say a particular thank you to my MKNA colleague, Preetha Kuchakula. Would you please stand? Preetha is the one who, if we, in this small section of this presentation, are opening the door to how the process worked, Preetha was the concierge of that system. And also in the room is Ryan Fisher, I believe. Ryan, please stand. Ryan is the person responsible at PPMD for, among many other things, the Community Advisory Board. The process is seen here through time. Pat discussed with you a number of the steps that were taken. I would point out to you, with a little bit of surprise, that this guidance was written in 6.5 months. So the many different moving parts of this machine came together very, very quickly. In addition, it was anchored in 4 different places. One, a steering committee of the best minds in the field from all over the world, whom, as Pat said, were volunteers. Next, each of those 7 working group chairs had associated with him or her a number of experts, 5, 20, people of real content expertise, including patient advocates. From the get-go, this guidance was intended to represent, to reflect, to push forward the needs, preferences, and experience of patients, parents, and advocates for people living with DMD. The Community Advisory Board, which represented the opinions of 40 highly engaged parents and patients, and finally in the background, the work we did as a secretariat, as well as the work of a professional writer. I mentioned the steering committee. I mentioned that these were the best minds in the field. You see them here with their affiliations. Perhaps you want to concentrate on the left-hand column because you'll see all stakeholders in the community. Basic and clinical researchers, industry, advocates, policymakers. Everyone in the community was at the table helping to form the guidance. These are the functions of the support team, not just a professional writer and the secretariat, but our colleague Tim Franson, who understands how policy is made in ways that supplemented the work of this organization. We've mentioned how the community was involved, this slide reminds us that PPMD has always had a drug development panel made up of representatives of industry. These kind of pre-existing mechanisms, the Community Advisory Board, the Duchenne Drug Development Panel, became very important arms of our guidance development effort. Here in greater detail, again, I ask you to concentrate on the left-hand column, shows the type of topics that were given to each working group. One working group per topic, and you can see the kind of substantive topics they were, and were you to read the guidance, the substantive information that they developed. Pat?
Thank you. So I think that one of the working groups, if you would have noticed on that last slide, and I don't know if So on number 7, you can see that working group was called the imperatives. And this was the voice and is the voice of the patient community. So the imperatives, at first we thought about it as policy, and then we really began to say, what does the patients want, and how will this reflect their need and their voice in this document? So when this was submitted to the FDA, the imperatives went into a cover letter because usually the patient voice and the patient preferences are not included in a guidance document. So these were in the cover letter. And these suggested things in terms of the patient voice, the things that all patients want and need. I'm sorry, I can't go on stage ever, right? This isn't going to work. I'll tell Kimberly that. So the patient voice, as we talked about imperatives, really sort of came into 3 central ideas. One is to eliminate placebo in clinical trials. I think that the risk of doing nothing is doing harm, right? So when there is a potential therapy, and this is what we talked about when we were talking about SPART patients, we have to think differently about trials because the anxiety and around the disease and the uncertainty of the progression of the disease and the knowledge of what's going to happen, right? You hear that on the day of diagnosis. So to risk having a placebo for 12 weeks, 24 weeks, 48 weeks is really impossible to expect of a patient. We have to do better trials. The second was to have trials that are shorter in duration. And this calls for a need for biomarkers so that we can very quickly understand if this drug is active, if it's conferring benefit, and then use post-marketing studies to look at the overall benefit and the long-term benefit in terms of efficacy. I think we also have to realize that in these diseases, if we start, for instance, a patient at 7 years old in the study, that child's had 7 years of pathology in terms of the disease course. So to imagine that you're going to reverse it or stop it in a period of 12 or 24 or 48 weeks is probably unlikely unless you have a blockbuster drug. So in the case of antisense oligonucleotides or exon skipping, we don't see dystrophin until a few weeks into the process. So we've already, in fact, lost time in terms of seeing benefit because you have to get dystrophin back, and then once you get it back. So it takes some time. So that was another issue for the patient voice that was quite strong. And the third sort of highlight of the patient voice was to include patients across the spectrum of the illness. Because at this moment, the 6-minute walk test is the primary outcome measure in most of the trials, if not all of them, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which eliminates children who are usually 5 or 6 years old and below, and certainly once the loss of ambulation occurs, eliminates that population. And as you might imagine, the older you get in Duchenne, the less muscle fibers you have and how precious they are to protect. So what does this mean to you, and why would we do it, and what does it mean? We think it changes regulatory policy. The FDA has now posted it for open public comment on their website. The public comment ends on October 6th, at which time the FDA has decided that they will issue guidance. So if you kind of think back to the meeting I talked about when we went in, the FDA said, when we talked about the EMA guidance, and they said, yes, we know it exists, but no, we're not going to write guidance. Less than 12 months, we give them guidance, and the FDA says we're going to issue guidance on Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and we expect that it will be out in early 2015. So that's changing regulatory policy for the FDA to say that. And it's been mentioned in an Institute of Medicine report as well. This enables the patient voice to be involved in regulatory policy in a very meaningful way. The FDA is looking at this model as one of the patient-focused drug development models, and that's why hopefully we are going soon to publish the methodology on this so that others may take benefit of this. This means that government, policy, and industry are actively listening to the patient voice and can act in ways that are meaningful for patients. So Janet Woodcock has said, we want to get drugs to patients as quickly as possible. So creating the guidance is going to help smooth that process, help inform sponsors who are developing drugs. It is an active process, so it isn't that this guidance is the beginning and the end of things. We expect to add addendums to this as new knowledge comes along. We have just had a meeting with the National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood, because one of the questions I think many of the parents who have children with Duchenne ask is the heart built to last? If you extend their skeletal muscle function, are you going to negatively impact the cardiac function? It's unknown. All of these children typically die of heart failure. So it's a question we need to ask. We met with with HLBI. We established a working group with National Institute of Heart, Lung, and Blood. Two of the FDA representatives were there and asked us for a guidance document. We supplied at this moment not a guidance document because it wasn't a formally produced document, but we did provide them guidelines, which they are now incorporating. So we expect this to be an active document. We will add as new knowledge comes along, as we understand more about natural history, as we understand more about biomarkers and how to look quickly at these children, maybe to qualify dystrophin as a biomarker, to look at MRI of muscle as a biomarker. So we're looking at ways to facilitate and accelerate drug development and clinical trials in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So we hope you'll use this as a model. We hope you'll think about this. But there's a lot to think about as an organization if you're going to embark on guidance. And that is, are you ready? How well is your disease characterized? Do you have the internal support? Do you have the community support? Do you have the financial support? I think for us and the people who worked on this guidance, it was a journey for all of us. We learned along the way. We had 46 different versions of this document that started very small and then got very big. And at version 46, we were all a little bit memorizing sentences and having struggles to read it. But nevertheless, it was a journey for all of us to learn about these working groups and about what that meant, benefit, risk. What's a diagnosis of Duchenne? How do you know? How do you diagnose it? What's the natural history? What do we know now? Where are the gaps in our learning? Biomarkers 1 was the replacement of dystrophin in muscle biopsy and the ethics around serial muscle biopsies in children with Duchenne. Biomarkers 2 looked at everything else, and this is all sorts of biomarkers, including urine and serum biomarkers as well as MRI. Then we looked at clinical trial design and talked about things that felt like a different language, the Bayesian method, which I'm just learning about, and I either have to have an abacus or a statistical person next to me just to kind of say that word out loud. And then the imperatives of what do patients want and how can they be involved, actively involved in something that means life or death. Thank you. Questions?
Come sit.
Okay.
So we've time for a few questions. Pat has raised the question of, how do you know if your organization is ready for a guidance? When is a guidance appropriate? What's required of an organization that wants to start that journey? What questions do you have for Pat or others of us who were involved in the process? Please.
If I may, can everybody hear me all right? Or the microphone? I just want to compliment you for the incredible work that you've done. That's incredibly impressive. To take that struggle and go and impact FDA policy and help with the regulatory policy is truly impressive. But that's one part of it, though. Even though super the momentum, thank you, I appreciate that. I don't want to go over. I'm too lazy. Everybody hear me better now? So I want to thank you again. I was reiterating and just want to share what an incredible accomplishment that is to do what you've done over that course of period of time is truly impressive, fighting the system and succeeding at it. Part of my question is this: once you do get a drug, what's the guarantee that a health insurance company will actually approve it and allow it to be used in care? Because there's two parts to this. It's even though if you get a drug, it doesn't guarantee the fact that a health insurance company will approve it and allow it to be used on the patient. So when you talk about patient advocacy, we can have all the best research, we can have all the best drugs, but how do we take it a step further that if a drug does exist, that we don't have to deal and have to fight with the health insurance company to get it approved?